Ladies and gentlemen, every so often we encounter a story, not just one that we hear, but one that we feel. A story that doesn't just move us, it shifts something deep inside us. It redefines how we see the world, how we see each other, and how we see ourselves. Today, I want to share with you a story that did exactly that. In the midst of unimaginable chaos, in a place torn apart by fear, loss, and uncertainty, Gaza, I met a Muslim family whose spirit, whose strength, and whose humanity shattered every assumption I didn't even know I was carrying. Their kindness wasn't loud, their courage wasn't showy, but it was there, in every word, every gesture, every act of quiet resistance. And it changed my heart forever, because sometimes we don't need more facts, we need more understanding. Sometimes we don't need more noise, we need more truth. And sometimes we don't need to win an argument, we need to witness a soul. This is not a story about war. This is a story about people, about dignity, about faith, about the kind of love that survives even when everything else is falling apart. So let me take you there. Let me tell you what they showed me, because their story just might change your heart too. In the heart of Gaza, where the noise of drones replaces the songs of birds, and where destruction writes itself across the skyline, I encountered something that pierced through the devastation more powerfully than any weapon ever could: dignity. This Muslim family, surrounded by rubble, fear, and loss, stood with a quiet strength that seemed to defy reality. There was no anger in their eyes, no cries for vengeance, no desperation in their voices. Instead, there was something more profound, something more unsettling in its grace. They held their heads high, offered tea with trembling hands, and smiled with a warmth that didn't belong in a war zone. That moment shattered the picture the world had painted for me. It forced me to realize that dignity is not a condition, it's a choice, and they had chosen it again and again in the most undignified of circumstances. The father of the family, whose home had been bombed just days before, sat across from me on a mat laid out on what was once a living room floor. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of rebuilding, of faith, of the need to protect his children's hearts from hatred. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. How does a man who has lost everything refuse to be bitter? How does he still offer his guest a seat of honor when he himself has none? That is when I understood something powerful. Dignity doesn't come from what you have, but from who you are. And when everything is taken from you, dignity is the one thing that cannot be stolen, unless you allow it to be. The mother, in her soft, worn hijab, moved with the grace of someone who had not allowed grief to corrode her gentleness. Her hands carried food to us: bread, olives, dates, each bite a gift carved out of scarcity. She served not out of obligation, but out of purpose. Her eyes told me stories of pain, but her actions screamed resilience. She reminded me that dignity is not about pride. It is about self-respect. It is about maintaining your humanity even when the world tries to strip it from you. Their children played nearby. There was laughter, real, uninhibited laughter. It echoed through the ruins as if hope had decided to wear the face of a child that day. In those children, I saw what their parents had fought to preserve, not just their lives, but their innocence, their joy, their belief in goodness. That's what dignity does. It protects what truly matters. It refuses to let suffering define identity. And when I looked at those kids, I didn't see victims. I saw little beacons of something unbreakable. I had always thought of strength in terms of power, loud, dominant, and forceful. But that day, I saw a kind of strength that whispers instead of roars. Dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. It simply is. It speaks through calm eyes in chaos, through generosity and scarcity, through grace and grief. This family's dignity wasn't performative. It wasn't for show. It was built into the fabric of who they were. And witnessing it felt like being humbled to the core. What struck me most was how they spoke of others. They didn't demonize anyone. They didn't engage in blame. Instead, they prayed for peace for all, not just for Gaza, but for the world. That kind of compassion in the middle of such brutality is the loudest form of resistance I've ever seen. They didn't shout, they lived. And in living with dignity, they exposed the lies that war tries to tell us, that there are sides, that there are villains and heroes. That suffering must breed hatred. They refuse to let war define their hearts. That family taught me that dignity is not an outcome of comfort. It is most visible in suffering. It is when everything is stripped away that dignity stands the tallest. You don't find it in speeches or symbols. You find it in the way a man opens his home when he barely has one, in the way a woman lays out food for strangers when her own pantry is bare, in the way a child laughs even as bombs echo in the distance. I walked away that day with more than just memories. I walked away with a new definition of what it means to be human. That family changed my heart not with their pain, but with their poise. Not with their tragedy, but with their choice to meet tragedy with grace. And I believe, now more than ever, that the greatest power any of us have in this world is to live with dignity, even when everything else is taken from us. When I met this Muslim family in Gaza, I expected to see grief, anger, and perhaps even bitterness. I expected pain to have hardened their hearts, to have taken away their ability to be gentle or kind. But what I found shook me to my core. Despite everything they had endured, the loss of their home, their friends, their safety, they chose compassion. They didn't just speak it, they lived it. And in doing so, they broke every narrative I had been fed about what it means to suffer. Because here they were, not as victims demanding the world's attention, but as humans offering me their trust, their warmth, and even their forgiveness. They had every right to hate, but they chose not to. It began with the father. He spoke softly, his voice measured and calm, even as he described the airstrikes, the nights spent hiding, the neighbors they had lost. And yet, not once did he curse anyone. Not once did he speak in absolutes. He didn't ask for vengeance, he asked for understanding. We are all people, he said. We bleed the same, we bury our dead the same. That statement hit me like a wave. How can a man who has seen his life turn to ash still look at the world with eyes that seek unity rather than division? It's because he made a conscious decision not to let pain turn into poison. That's the thing about compassion. It's a choice, a hard one. And in places like Gaza, where every day is a reminder of how cruel life can be, choosing compassion is the most courageous act of all. The mother who had lost her sister in a recent bombing still insisted that I take extra food. You're our guest, she said, as if hospitality should remain untouched by grief. I asked her how she kept giving when she had already lost so much. She smiled faintly and said, "Giving keeps my heart from breaking." That answer stayed with me, because it taught me something profound. Compassion is not weakness. It is a form of protection, a shield for the soul. Their children had questions for me, not about politics or power, but about life beyond the wall. What schools were like, what trees looked like in spring, if birds sang differently where I lived. They were curious, kind, and incredibly polite. There was no trace of hostility in them, only the universal hunger of children to learn and connect. The family had made a conscious effort to raise them without hate, even as the world gave them every reason to be angry. That kind of parenting is not accidental, it's intentional, rooted in a belief that the future can still be kind if we make it so. As I sat with them longer, I realized that their compassion wasn't performative. It wasn't something they turned on for visitors. It was embedded in their daily lives. A neighbor arrived needing help repairing part of their roof, and without hesitation, the father rose to assist, even though his own home was far from secure. When I asked him why, he simply said, "If we stop helping each other, we stop being who we are." That one sentence explained everything. For them, compassion wasn't conditional. It wasn't limited to those who could return the favor. It was a way of life. It was their resistance against the dehumanization of war. We often talk about changing the world with grand gestures, with movements and marches and loud voices. But this family showed me that real change begins in the quietest places, in kitchens where tea is shared, in homes where forgiveness is chosen over fury, in conversations where empathy replaces accusation. They weren't trying to prove a point. They were simply living their values. And in doing so, they opened a space inside me I didn't know existed. I walked into that home expecting to feel sorry for them. I left feeling humbled by them. They had taught me that compassion is not something you offer when it's easy, it's something you choose when it's hardest. And that choice, repeated day after day in the face of suffering, becomes the most powerful form of resistance imaginable. The world might have taken their comfort, their peace, even their loved ones, but it hadn't taken their kindness. And as long as they had that, they were not broken. What they showed me was that the human heart has a capacity far beyond what we give it credit for. That even in the midst of cruelty, compassion can still bloom. And that when it does, it doesn't just heal others, it heals the one who gives it. That family didn't just change the way I see Gaza. They changed the way I see humanity. They reminded me that the most radical thing we can do in a world filled with division is to choose love anyway. The family I met in Gaza carried something with them that I couldn't fully understand at first. It wasn't just their warmth, their compassion, or their dignity. It was something deeper, something invisible yet overwhelming. It was faith. Not the kind of faith that gets spoken about in rituals or recited in moments of ease, but a raw, unshakable faith that stands firm when the world collapses. Their faith wasn't a comfort blanket, it was a foundation. And watching how they held on to it, not despite their suffering, but through it, changed how I understood what it means to believe in something greater than yourself. I sat with the father one evening as the call to prayer echoed faintly from a distant, damaged mosque. His prayer mat was frayed, the floor beneath it cracked and uneven, but he laid it down as if he were standing on sacred ground. He didn't pray with dramatic expression or for my attention. He simply knelt, whispered his prayers, and returned to the moment with a peace on his face that made me pause. I asked him, How do you still believe after all this? He looked at me, not surprised by the question, and said, because if I stop believing now, then the suffering wins twice. That response was not defiance, it was clarity. His faith wasn't just something he turned to when he needed hope, it was what held him together when nothing else could. His wife, too, spoke about faith with the same quiet conviction. She told me that when their house was bombed and they had to run barefoot into the night with their children, she clutched her Koran. Not because she thought it would save her physically, but because it reminded her who she was. The world wants us to believe we are forgotten. She said, but faith tells me we are seen. That kind of faith cannot be taught. It is forged in suffering, in choosing to believe when logic and evidence offer no reason to. It is, in every sense, a rebellion against despair. The children prayed too, not just because their parents told them to, but because it was part of their rhythm, their way of staying connected to something steady. And in a world where everything around them had been made unstable, faith was the one thing that had not changed. I watched as the youngest boy, barely 6, repeated verses with such concentration that you'd think he was memorizing the coordinates of hope. And in a way he was, because faith for this family wasn't just about religion. It was about orientation. It was the compass they used to move forward, even in the dark. There is something profoundly humbling about witnessing faith like that. In my own life, faith had often been intellectual, something to question, study, or debate. But here in Gaza, faith was living and breathing. It wasn't a shield from pain, but a lens through which they saw their pain, transformed it, understood it, survived it. It was what gave their suffering meaning, what kept them from turning into people defined by what had happened to them. They believed there was a purpose, even if they didn't always see it. And that belief gave them strength far greater than anything I had seen in comfort. One evening, the mother invited me to sit with her while she recited from the Quran. Her voice was soft, steady, and full of emotion. I didn't understand every word, but I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of her faith in every syllable. I asked her if she ever doubted. She smiled and said, doubt is human. But giving up is a choice, and I choose to hold on. That sentence stayed with me long after I left, because we often confuse faith with certainty, when in reality it is about endurance. It is about choosing trust over fear, even when fear feels more justified. This family didn't wear their faith to be praised. They weren't trying to prove anything. Their belief wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It showed up in their patience, in their refusal to hate, in their ability to find peace in prayer, and in their hope that tomorrow could still bring something better. They taught me that true faith isn't proven by how often you speak of it, but by how you live when everything else is taken from you. Faith that stands when everything falls. That's what I saw. Not miracles, not magic, but a quiet, a powerful conviction that carried through the unthinkable. And in watching them live by that faith, I realized something I hadn't expected. Their belief gave me something to believe in. It reminded me that there is still strength in surrender, still purpose in pain, and still light to be found in the darkest places. Strength is a word we often misunderstand. We associate it with force, dominance, noise, and visibility. We imagine heroes as those who stand tall, raise their voices, and lead from the front. But the family I met in Gaza redefined strength for me in a way I never saw coming. Their strength wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It didn't wear armor or carry weapons. It was quiet, steady, and rooted in something far deeper than control. It was the kind of strength that doesn't try to fight every battle, but knows exactly when to be still. It was the strength of silence, of sacrifice, of choosing peace over pride, and it shook me to my core. The father was not a man who raised his voice. In fact, he barely spoke unless he had something meaningful to say. Yet, when he did speak, there was gravity in his words, not because he tried to sound important, but because he didn't waste words. He carried himself with a humility that made you lean in to listen. I remember asking him how he kept calm after everything. After losing his home, his job, and some of his closest friends, he looked at me for a moment, then said, because if I let anger lead me, I become what I'm trying to survive. That sentence broke something inside me, because I realized he had made peace with pain in a way most of us never learn to. The mother embodied another form of strength, one that was even harder for me to comprehend. She was soft-spoken, gentle in her movements, and always thinking of others. But behind that calm exterior was someone carrying unimaginable weight. She was holding together a family that had been torn apart, not just by war, but by grief, fear, and constant uncertainty. And she never once asked for sympathy. She cooked, cleaned. She comforted her children when the ground trembled under their feet. She stitched together a home out of nothing but love and willpower, the most powerful thing she did. She didn't complain. Not because she didn't feel pain, but because she had made peace with it. She had learned that strength is not always about overcoming. Sometimes it's about enduring. Their silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a shield. It was a boundary. In a world that constantly demanded their pain be politicized, debated, or dismissed, they chose silence as a way to hold on to their dignity. They didn't scream about their suffering. They didn't broadcast their losses. They simply lived through them, and in doing so, they preserved a part of themselves that no war could touch. That's what strength looks like when you have nothing left to prove. It's not about winning. It's about surviving without letting your soul grow hard. Sacrifice was woven into their daily existence. The father went without meals so his children could eat more. The mother shared her medicines with a neighbor who needed them more urgently. The children gave up their toys to bring joy to younger kids in the neighborhood who had lost everything. These weren't grand acts meant to be admired. They were quiet decisions made again and again, rooted in love. That's the kind of strength that goes unnoticed by the world, but defines the heart of a people. I had always thought strength was about standing up, but this family showed me that sometimes strength is about staying down by choice, not because you've been defeated, not because you refuse to meet hatred with hatred, because you know your silence speaks louder than screams, because you understand that survival isn't always about fighting, but about letting the fight change who you are. That's what they taught me. What stood out most to me was their refusal to blame. They had every reason to be angry at the world, every right to be filled with rage. And yet, they chose responsibility over resentment. They chose to focus on what they could still control, how they treated each other, how they spoke to strangers, how they carried their pain. In doing so, they showed a strength that most of us never reach, because we're too busy trying to look strong instead of being strong. Their story didn't come with dramatic gestures or emotional breakdowns. It came in the form of a mother smoothing her daughter's hair while sirens wailed in the distance. A father patching a roof with his bare hands, his family needed shelter. A child sharing half his bread without being told to. That is strength. That is power. And it doesn't need to be recognized to be real. I left their home that day with a new understanding of what strength means. It's not in the shout. It's in the stillness. It's not in the resistance. It's in the resilience. And above all, it's in the choice to stay soft in a world that constantly tries to make you hard. Hope is a fragile thing, especially in a place like Gaza. It's hard to imagine that something so delicate could survive amid airstrikes, broken buildings, and the daily uncertainty of life. And yet, in the heart of destruction, I found hope not only alive, but fiercely protected. This Muslim family didn't speak of hope as a dream or an escape. They lived it. They wove it into their routine, their conversations, their prayers, and their plans for the future. It wasn't blind optimism. It wasn't NARV or disconnected from the painful reality they faced. Their hope was deliberate, disciplined, and defiant. It was a refusal to let despair have the final word. It began with the father's daily routine. Every morning, even when sleep had been broken by the sound of distant explosions, he would rise, wash, and prepare for the day. There was no assurance the day would be safe, no certainty that they'd make it through without loss. But he moved with purpose. He would fix what he could, patching holes in the roof, helping neighbors rebuild walls, collecting firewood from the rubble. He wasn't just surviving, he was investing in tomorrow. I asked him why he worked so hard when everything might be destroyed again. He smiled and said, because one day it won't be. And when that day comes, we must be ready. That answer didn't come from comfort. It came from conviction. That's what hope looks like when it's built on courage. His wife, too, carried this silent strength of hopeful intention. She insisted her children continue their studies, even if their classroom was a corner of their damaged living room. She made sure they dressed neatly, even if their clothes were worn and faded. She enforced routines, morning prayers, shared meals, bedtime stories, because she knew structure creates stability, and stability keeps the soul from collapsing. Her hope wasn't loud. It was in her eyes when she looked at her children, in the way she held their faces while they spoke, in the gentle way she corrected them, even when she herself was running on empty. They must believe that life is still beautiful, she told me, even if only in moments. And then there were the children. They played among ruins, turning broken bricks into toys, using shattered glass to reflect sunlight and make patterns on the wall. They didn't ignore the sounds of war. They flinched, they hid. But when the silence returned, they ran back out again. They laughed, shared secrets, and asked questions about the world beyond Gaza with wide-eyed wonder. One of the older boys told me he wanted to be a doctor. Not just for here, he said, but to help people anywhere. That kind of hope, spoken in a place that tries to crush dreams before they can even form, is revolutionary. Hope, I learned, is not just a feeling. It's a responsibility. This family treated hope like a seed, something they had to nurture, water, and protect every single day. It was present in the way they supported one another, how they remained connected to their neighbors, how they kept telling stories of the past and dreams for the future. They refused to let the present moment define them entirely. And that resistance, quiet though it was, became a form of protest or rebellion against hopelessness. What moved me most was how their hope was not limited to themselves. They hoped for others too. They prayed not only for peace in Gaza, but for peace in the hearts of those who didn't understand their struggle. They believed in the goodness of people they had never met. They hoped that someday someone would hear their story not as a tragedy, but as a testament. We don't want pity, the father said. We want to be seen as people who still hope. That distinction changed me. It reminded me that true hope is not born in ease, it's forged in fire. Before I left, the mother gave me a gift, a small piece of embroidery sewn with thread salvaged from old garments. This is our map of hope, she said, pointing to the colors and shapes. It has no borders, just patterns that go on and on. That embroidery now hangs in my home, a reminder that even in the darkest places, people are stitching together a future. A reminder that hope, when chosen daily, becomes not just survival, but vision. This family didn't wait for conditions to improve before choosing hope. They made it part of who they were, part of how they breathed, lived, and moved through the world. And in witnessing their refusal to let loss or fear take that away, I saw a side of humanity I will never forget. Their hope didn't erase their pain, but it gave them power over it. It gave them direction. And it gave me something I didn't know I was missing, a reason to believe that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, light still finds a way. When I first entered Gaza, I carried with me all the assumptions I didn't even know I had, shaped by headlines, filtered images, political narratives, and the comfort of distance. I believed I was going there to witness suffering, to feel sympathy, maybe even to offer something of value. But what I found was something that dismantled me in the best possible way, a mirror, not a reflection of myself, but a reflection of everything I didn't understand about humanity, identity, and connection. This Muslim family didn't just show me who they were, they helped me rediscover who I was. And that realization changed the way I see the world forever. We often walk through life thinking we know what matters: success, security, reputation, routine. We chase comfort. We structure our days to avoid inconvenience. And from within that safe structure, we look at the rest of the world through a window, rarely questioning the view. But when you sit down on a torn mat in a room with cracked walls and still feel surrounded by grace, you begin to ask yourself, what have I been missing? This family didn't have much in terms of possessions, but they had something I had long buried under business and ambition: presence. They were present with each other in a way that felt sacred. No one stared into a screen while someone else was speaking. Meals were slow, shared, and full of conversation. Eye contact was deep. Affection wasn't reserved for special occasions. It flowed constantly like a quiet stream that nourished everything it touched. And as I watched them this way, something inside me softened. I realized how often I'd been in a room with people and yet completely absent. How often I'd chosen distraction over connection. This family didn't need to preach anything to me. Their way of being was the lesson. They were also profoundly grounded in who they were. Despite everything they had endured, they didn't define themselves by victimhood. They held their identity with pride and gentleness. Their faith wasn't something they performed. It shaped their posture, their patience, their choices. I found myself drawn to the rhythm of their life, not because it was simple, because it was rooted. There was a consistency between what they believed and how they lived, and that integrity challenged me. I began to reflect on how often I compromised what I valued for convenience, how easily I bent my convictions to suit my mood or ambition. In their steadfastness, I saw a blueprint for authenticity. The most profound shift happened inside me when I stopped seeing them as the other. At first, even with good intentions, I saw them through a lens of difference, different country, religion, language, struggles. But the longer I stayed, the more those labels dissolved. I saw a father who wanted the best for his children, a mother whose laughter could brighten a room, children who dreamed of things far beyond their borders. I saw myself in them. I saw my own family in theirs. And I felt the weight often we allow superficial differences to build emotional walls that rob us of deep human connection. Their generosity also left me undone. They gave me tea when they barely had water. They offered me food with hands that had already given away too much. They welcomed me into their space not as a guest, but as someone worthy of trust. And that kind of open-heartedness in the face of hardship made me question the way I give, the way I welcome, and the limits I put around compassion. I had walked in thinking I was going to be the giver, but I left realizing how much I had been given. And maybe the most startling realization of all was this: the world isn't divided between the fortunate and the unfortunate, the givers and the receivers, the strong and the weak. That's the illusion. The truth is, we are all both. We are all vulnerable. We are all capable of immense grace. And sometimes the people we think have the least to offer end up offering us the parts of ourselves we lost. That Muslim family in Gaza didn't just open their home to me. They opened a door inside me I didn't know was closed. They showed me that the essence of life isn't in what we achieve or accumulate, but in how deeply we live, how fully we connect, and how fiercely we love, especially when it costs us. I left with my heart cracked open, not from sadness, but from recognition. They didn't just survive a war. They survived it with their humanity intact. And in doing so, they helped me find mine.